Hello everybody. So I'm going to be presenting to you all my proposal that I'm now getting ready to work on. And I know my title is a mouthful, so let's get right to it and understand what I'm trying to get at. So what's my problem? My problem is that planners are struggling to incorporate urban climatology as a component of plans in a city or a regional scale. In a lot of the discussions, when you look at literature, sometimes point to a knowledge gap, or when you look at practice, maybe we're needing new tools, new models, softwares maybe. So I dived into the literature and tried to see from the urban climatology perspective, what do we have, what's out there for information that might be able to inform these planners. And from that standpoint, it's quite clear that there is discussions of how the urban environment actually impacts and alters climate interactions. More importantly, it focuses on how this is a very dynamic process and it's constantly evolving. So the knowledge is there. There's several models and softwares that are actually cited. But then from the planning perspective, what we're looking at is the recognition of these interactions, and the changes are occurring because of this environment, but it doesn't really point to a solution, particularly on the scales that I'm looking towards, which is city and regional scales. But there's also this call from scholars and academia for guidelines and procedures, and more importantly, talking about how this is not a visual problem. What do I mean by this? Well, when you look at how urban climatology looks at climate, we're talking about a very dynamic process. So it's change over time. It's practically a very linear, sort of horizontal way of interpreting these overlays when we're thinking about mapping. And when we're talking about what the literature is telling us, we're saying climate is interactive, changing and local. Practice needs to adapt. There's a call for adaptation. From the planning side, however, the incorporation of climate is a static incorporation. And the reason for it is the way the overlay happens, where you're stacking information, and climate comes then as a moment, a fragment of time incorporated into the planning process. And in discussions in the literature, we're looking at climate as either a very big global problem or a very site-specific problem, and even individualized problem. And again, a constant call for a production of procedural or guidelines to help us. So stepping back a little bit, I'm going to say why I'm looking at Savannah and this, why I chose this site. Well, for starters, Savannah has a head start in dealing with urban climatology from the flooding and sea level rise aspects of climate, a visible portion of climate interactions in a city and regional scale. Second, there's a rising awareness about heat-related illnesses and mortality. Savannah is a hot and humid environment, and there are two very recent reports pointing to Savannah, naming it as one of the critical areas that need to be tackled when we look at heat-related illnesses and mortality. And in my previous research, I also had identified the occurrence of urban heat islands in Savannah. Thirdly, the Savannah downtown, which has proven to be a resilient environment to natural hazards. It's a historic downtown, and also it's a designed plan. And it's hailed in contemporary architecture and planning as a city that is walkable and sustainable, yet it was not designed with that in mind. And the way the plazas are designed allow for the tree cover to actually permeate that urban fabric, and it promotes wind flow and reduces the impacts of these heat islands. So it's an interesting study case to look at when we're talking about planning at the intersection of climate. So I'm focusing on planning for health and well-being. And to do so, I'm looking at two particular disciplines. Human bioclimatology, which is a sub-discipline of urban climatology, looking at particularly at thermal comfort, and applying thermal comfort and heat stress indices as a quantitative analysis of human perception of climate. And the reason I'm using these is because they allow me to do a more individualized and particularly localized analysis of climate, and it can become visual, and so I can incorporate these into maps. And they also give me a very nuanced form of displaying how comfortable or uncomfortable people are in these environments. The other discipline that I'm incorporating is critical human geography and planning theory. And the reason why I'm picking these two is to actually look at the critique to planning practice, and in particular its form of expertise. And it's a pragmatic approach because I'm focusing particularly on the materiality and the scale at which this issue is discussed in planning and it's tackled, but also looking at how co-production can be used as both a theory and a form of applied critical practice, incorporating this into my methodology. And if you're wondering what human bioclimatology looks like, it's incorporating the environmental aspects of climate with the human physiological response to them. And so it's a calculated formula based on the activities and the environment that the person is in, and you then create this sort of scale that goes from heat stress all the way to cold stress. And these vary, and there are several options that I have to use. I'm particularly going to test out 3, but since I'm working with state agencies, the index mostly used is the heat stress index. So what's my main question? My main question is the use of, while I'm using Savannah as a study case, I'm trying to get at 2 issues. How professional practice can actually apply urban climatology in a city scale, and then how bioclimatology, the study of human perception, might be this missing link to the application of urban climatology in planning, incorporating it. And basically I'm asking, how can climatological data be incorporated in the planning of the built environment in Savannah, Georgia? My main objectives, firstly and foremost, is to work collaboratively with practitioners. And I'm trying to co-develop a methodology that addresses human health and well-being at the intersection of climate and planning. Engage with practice and actively experience the barriers that might occur while I'm trying to incorporate this incorporate urban climatology. And then expand on practices by creating a replicable, and this is very important, non-generalizable methodology. If we're talking about localized effects, there's no way you can replicate this in the same way. It can't be general. To address human health and well-being. So what additional questions do I need to be answered to address these objectives? Well, my first sub-question is, how can thermal comfort and heat stress indices be applied in the city scale for land use plans to inform decision makers on urban climate interactions? Secondly, in what ways can the analysis of change over time in thermal comfort and heat stress aid land use plans to actually define social environmental thresholds related to these interactions? And finally, how can planning practitioners and climatologists utilize a co-production framework to cultivate better understandings of dynamic, localized, and social environmental aspects of urban climate interactions? So how am I going to go about this? Well, I'm going to use a technique called geodesign and try to co-create the methodology with a number of state agencies. So calling upon people that are actively working either in planning or in hazards planning in the coast, or dealing with health and also with the indices that I'm talking about. And so they're actually applying it, but they're not applying it to decision making right now in planning, and also with the EPA, and trying to think about how these all collectively work with the environment, and with them actually define how would we define what is vulnerable, what areas need to be addressed, or what's our time frame, how do we identify these thresholds, and are they occurring, if any, and how does vulnerability change over time? For all this to come together and for geodesign to be successful, I'm crucially relying on GIS. So all of these agencies are using GIS as a form of designing and mapping where problems are. But from the planning standpoint, Ian McHarg's methodology is at the core of how we design and plan. So I'm going to look towards Ian McHarg to see where might be the barriers between practice. What is it that we do, that practitioners do, that is different from the way scholars and academics in climate science and in the government agencies, particularly looking at the data exchange and the communication of the results and the ways we overlay this information to come to an analysis and enable the evaluation of this representation and the procedural practice between everyone. I'm also going to use simulations to compare the results to the co-created methodology. And this is very important because, like I said, the government agencies like the CDC or the National Weather Service rely on the heat stress index. But there are other indexes that are more robust and actually could add new layers and point to thresholds or areas that with a simpler index might not be showing up. Finally, I'm incorporating qualitative forms of analysis. So I'm going to start with a structured interview, trying to figure out what the social networks are before we're actually all coming together to work together. So do these people actually rely on each other and already communicate and exchange information between them? And then after we're done with the process, again, doing an interview and finding out whether or not there was a change, and now they've made new connections and they're now going to use each other as that part of their social network. We're also doing focus groups. So we're getting together and meeting 5 times during my project. And so the focus groups are 1 to 2 hour discussions after these geodesign meetings where we're collectively working on GIS and trying to map out and analyze the information that we've got and into trying to figure out, are we missing somebody? Should we call more people to the table to work with us? What sort of information are we getting at? Is this what we're trying to get? Do we need to redefine anything? And then finally, as a participant myself experiencing these barriers, I want to understand how this practice is occurring, but also if there's a difference between attitudes, discourse, and the actual attitude and the way we work together. So what's important from this research and what I hope to take away? Well, from the intellectual merit standpoint, this is a transdisciplinary research, particularly focused on practice. The use of human bioclimatology is very novel in the US. There's very little literature, particularly in practice, using human bioclimatology, particularly to express the dynamic and localized effects of climate. Critical geography as a lens to pragmatically address situated and nuanced perceptions of climate. And then the broader impacts, co-producing a methodology with practitioners and particularly focusing on it being a replicable methodology, but a non-generalizable methodology. Again, with bioclimatology, using the data that we're creating to make this information available and visual, particularly focusing on the exposure to extreme heat and the embodied experience of climate itself. And then finally, document the methodology created and communicate findings to convey the importance of human health and well-being in planning and decision-making for plans that are long-term, 30 to 50-year long-term. Thank you.
We have time for a quick question if anybody has one.
Yeah, Emily.
Yeah.
So, for the stakeholders that you're interested in measuring this, the stress index, the heat stress index, are you thinking about residents? Are you thinking about, are these people that you're actually going to be?
For this portion, I don't envision us dealing directly with the people in Savannah, but rather using census data or tax data, and so how we incorporate demographic data to analyze, to generate the calculations that we need. For any of these indexes, basically what you're going to need to know is the age groups that you have and the gender, sex, not gender, and the clustering of the environments. Basically, you're not going to need go one-on-one. But you can, I can see this as a second stage where you're validating